you've spoken about the lost cradle of civilization in South America. So, South America is not often talked about as one of the cradles of civilization. South America, Mesoamerica. Can you explain?
Well, we have very early stuff in South America. You're right. I mean, especially as an American, our country's so big, and we are so far removed from these places, we don't even think about it. But more and more, we're seeing things that predate the earliest stuff that we like to talk about, like Egypt and Mesopotamia. There are things, it's all on the Peruvian coast that we have these cradles of civilization. Someday we might start talking about the Amazon more and more. But right now, what we've got are things that date back into the 3000s BCE along the coast of Peru. And there are big stone-built pyramids and temples. And they're amazingly isolated, even now that we've found them. Some of them, like Caral, is one of the most famous ones, just north of Lima. We've known about it for a couple decades now, how old it is. But every time I visit there, it's like I've visited the moon. There's absolutely nobody there, not for miles. It's amazing how such a discovery was made, and yet still nobody goes to see it. It's not easy to get to.
So you think there's a bunch of locations like that? Some may not have been discovered in the Peru area.
Oh, there are so many. Peru has tons. That desert gets really ugly quick, and it buries things completely. There are so many pyramids out there that are still completely untouched. When people hear the name pyramids, they think of Egypt immediately. But Egypt has got about 140 pyramids, and we have pretty much found them all. Peru has thousands of pyramids. And now they weren't built of a lot. Not all of them were built of stone. Some of them were adobe bricks, which have weathered terribly. So now they don't look, they're not exciting places to visit today. You know what's funny too? We started off talking about, whether I think there's a lost civilization out there. There are definitely things that are still to be discovered, but there are some things that were discovered 100 years ago, and archaeologists, or back then they called themselves antiquarians, just kind of passed over. Caral was one of these sites because the coast of Peru has some of those pyramids that were made by the Moche are full of gold and beautiful ceramics and things that you can sell for big money. But Caral was found a long time ago, but the archaeologist was like, no gold, no ceramics. Forget about it. This place is no good. We can't sell anything here. And then about the 1970s or 80s, somebody said, hey, no ceramics? Is that older than the invention of ceramics? Shit, we better go take another look at that place.
So what's the dating on Caral?
Caral, I think, starts at about 3200 BCE, and it lasts as a major civilization with a lot of other cities around it until about 1800 BCE.
So what's the story behind, like, looking at some of these images? What's the story about constructions like that? What was the idea?
That thing, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, it should be some sort of, I'll be a flaky archaeologist, like, this is a place where rituals took place. That's so many things we say are so just painfully vague, and that's about, what we got. And a place like this, I know the one we're looking at here, I've been here a couple of times. In the pyramid behind it, the rubble's built in a way where the building won't rock apart. This is a very earthquake-prone place, but the buildings haven't fallen because they make these net baskets of rocks inside that all kind of wiggle around and don't allow the building to fall down. And inside these, we've also found a couple of things that were human babies that were buried in there. And I don't think there's a lot of people that see that and go, oh, look at that. They were sacrificing babies, these monsters. I think a lot of the things that are interpreted as baby sacrifices, Caral's evidence being one of them, I think it's more about the tragic nature of infant mortality. In the past, it was a lot more common. There were cultures that didn't even really properly name their kid until they got to 5 because chances were they were going to die. And so I think a lot of these babies that we find in these ceremonial contexts that are interpreted as sacrifices, I think they're putting them in special places because they mourn the death of their kids. And it just happened a lot more frequently then.
One of the things you said that really surprised me is that pyramids were built in Peru possibly hundreds of years before they were built in Egypt. Is that true?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact,
That's crazy.
There's one that's now pushing 6,000 BCE. Like, that's thousands of years before the stuff in Egypt. And that one's called Waka Prieta. And it was not an Egyptian pyramid. But it was a pyramid, and it was thousands of years before.
What do you think is the motivation to build a pyramid? The fact that it can withstand the elements structurally, that kind of thing? Is it, why do humans build pyramids? And why do they build it in all kinds of different locations in the world?
Well, my rude answer is pretty boring, really. A lot of people ask me, why are there pyramids all over the planet? How is that? Is that a coincidence? I mean, who?
Yeah.
I think that when people wanted to build a big building without rebar or cement, you end up building something with a fat base that goes up to a skinny top, and that turns into a pyramid. Any kid who's playing with blocks on the floor builds a couple towers, and his brother knocks him down. And if he wants one that's going to stay and be tall, he ends up making something with a fat base and a tiny top. And I think that building something big and tall together is one of those human things. Like, we built that will be here after we're gone. People remember who we were. We are all, if there's any human commonality, it's fear of our own deaths and that we were nothing and no one will ever remember us. I think that the first big monuments like that were probably a group of people saying, we're going to do something that people will remember forever. Now, that being said, you remember we were just talking about Waka Prieta, and this one that's almost 6,000 BC now is the first one. That one's a funny case. We just talked about all these lofty goals, but actually, I'm pretty sure that Waka Prieta's first pyramid was about capping a smelly pile of trash. I think everybody piled up their trash in the middle of town, and it stunk. It's on the coast. It stunk like fish. And somebody said, if we just bury this thing with dirt, it won't smell anymore. And then it was a big mound where people could get up and talk to everybody. And then said, well, it's squishy. If we cap it with clay, then it will really not smell. I really think that the very first pyramids in Peru were about trash management. Talk about deflating, huh?
Yeah, but then they probably saw it and they were impressed and humbled by the sort of the enormity of the construction, and then they're like, oh, maybe the next guy thought maybe we should keep building these kinds of things.
Yeah. In not to jump ahead, but in North America, where they also made pyramids, there's this interesting evolution where there were these piles of shells along rivers and along the coastlines. People ate a lot of shells. That was an easy thing to collect and eat. So these piles of shells would be near communities, and they probably became landmarks, but eventually they started burying their dead inside those too. Probably, again, about stink and about, well, we don't want the dogs to eat them. Maybe we'll put them in the middle of the shell pile. But then that all of a sudden became this, like, that's where my grandfather's body is. That's where great-grandfather's body is. And all of a sudden people started being attached to place, not just for the resources, but for the shared memories of their ancestors. So when the very first pyramid was built in Ohio area by the Adena people, it was built out of dirt, but it's full of bodies. And I think it's an echo of a old thing where they used to be putting bodies in shell mounds.
So where And who were the first civilizations in South America, Mesoamerica?
Well, I think we're still piecing that together. Coming back to the first things we talked about, I think we're still missing a lot of stuff, especially in South America. It just keeps getting older and older. Part of the reason it's hard to answer that question is, at what point do we consider people a civilization or a culture? We have in the Americas this long period of time that we call the Paleo-Indian time, where they were hunting megafauna. And then when those went away, we get into this even longer period of time called the Archaic, where they're just hunters and gatherers. Sometimes somebody's coming up with a cool, different kind of arrowhead. They go back and forth with different hunting tools, but really nothing changes for thousands of years. And then finally, they start developing into these larger groups, which for the most part has to do with agriculture. It used to be archaeology. That was just the end all be all. Civilization starts with the invention of agriculture. And we can't have sedentary communities until people learn how to farm. But that's been discounted. Peru was a big part of that. That area of Caral, it's connected to another city on the coast called Aspero. And Aspero starts about the same time, but they're all about fishing. They have no farming. And Caral, who's upriver from them, is farming, but funny enough, they're not really farming food. They're farming cotton, and they're making nets, and they're trading the nets with the people on the coast for the fish. So it's not as simple as it's just agriculture anymore. But it is, I think, still rooted in how can we feed more people than just our family? How can we together create a food abundance so we're no longer scared about running out of food?
So is it possible, which is something you've argued, that civilization started in the Amazon, in the jungle?
I do
versus the
think
coast?
so. I think religion in South America began in the Amazon. I think there were people there very old. There's actually the earliest pottery in all of the Americas. Of all these places that we have civilizations that grew up, you know where the oldest pottery is? The middle of the Amazon.